Hello. Today we're going to take a look at the Great Migration. The Great Migration took place in the United States, started in about 1918 and went to about 1930. Prior to 1920, most African Americans lived in rural areas in the South. By 1920, there was a large percentage of African Americans that were leaving the South and they're concentrating in the cities listed here: Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. This was known as the Great Migration. It was one of the largest internal movements of people in the history of the United States, and it is a shift that impacted the culture, politics, and economics as the new African American communities struggled to thrive in their new environments. So if you take a look at this first graphic here, so you can see that most people were migrating to those 8 cities that we had just talked about. And then you can see where they're coming from, and if you look closely at these are mainly going to be your sharecropping states. So it gives you an idea that African Americans were looking to get out of that sharecropping and then move to these other cities to get better opportunities. Another graphic here shows that some of the migration did actually start in 1916, but the majority of it started in 1918. What this shows is the different areas that they went to. Besides just those 8 main cities that we talked about, they did migrate to some of these other areas as well, albeit most of these areas did have some industrial centers as well. What is interesting about it is based on your location in the South, you tended to follow the same track. So if you were down in here, you typically went up and you settled in these areas here. So they kind of follow the same migration patterns based on their geography. So let's take a look at this quote. Some are coming on the passenger, some are coming on the freight, others will be found walking, for none have time to wait. And this was published in the Chicago Defender. What's interesting about this is it's really showing that they are so eager to get out of the South that they didn't matter how they got out. If they had any type of money saved up, they took passenger and freight. If they didn't have any money, they just walked. They walked from the South to the North just to get out of that situation, showing you how bad it must have been if people are willing to walk from the South all the way to the North. So here's a picture showing in the upper left here, showing some people that were just out walking just to get out of it. And then this picture on the lower left shows a family who had just migrated from the South and came into Chicago. Now, we want to take a look at what are some of the push and pull factors that were involved in this process. Thinking back to what we've learned about earlier this year, it's going to make a lot of sense, and it's starting to pull all of this information together for us. So let's start with some of our push factors. So we know that African Americans, once slavery ended, they came into sharecropping. They needed to have work, they needed to have a place to stay. So these large plantation owners, they needed a workforce because they couldn't manage their entire plantations, so they divided them up in plots and they had their African Americans working on them, and they were given a percentage of their crops in. But this tied them to that system of debt, because with that debt, they had to go into debt to get the supplies to be able to plant the crops, and they had to give a certain percentage of their crops away. Now, they weren't always able to pay all their debts all the time, and that really trapped them in that system of debt all the time. And so they were starting to see that this was not the life for them. They were never going to get out of this, so it was time for them to leave. Another thing that came in was the boll weevil. The boll weevil is a bug that migrated from South America into the southern United States, and it would destroy crops, specifically the cotton crop. And then when those crops are destroyed, those farmers are not able to pay their debt, and they're not able to pay their debt, the percentage of their crops, to the landlord as well. And so it further trapped them in this system of debt. Another thing we've talked about when it came to voting, they had to pay taxes, or you had your grandfather clauses, understanding tests or literacy tests. So these forms of discrimination showing that even though they're free and even though the Constitution says they have the right to vote, they're putting systems in place to make sure that African Americans could not vote. And so with this form of discrimination, the African Americans, like, we can't make it here. We're not looked at as equals. We want to be equals. We need to get out. Another thing that was pushing them out of the South was your Jim Crow laws and your social segregation. So you had your discrimination through your social segregation and wanting something better. We want a better life. So they had to look for other opportunities, giving them a reason to be pushed to the North. Another one had to do with all the lynchings that were taking place in the South. They had a fear for their lives, and because of this fear, it was forcing them to seek a better life. And so most of the lynchings, as we had studied, had taken place in the South. And this is where the KKK was the strongest. And so they said that this is another one of those main reasons that they're being pushed out of the South. They don't want us here. Let's go to the North and seek better opportunities. Now to take a look at some of the pull factors. So they were pulled because of a better way of life. And in the North, we are going to learn a little bit later on in this unit that they were able to express themselves through creative arts, such as something similar to this. And so when the migration started gaining movement, more and more people started leaving. In the background of the picture, you can see factories. So giving you an idea that you had job opportunities that were available in the North. And then in the forefront of the picture, you see some people sitting around like a picnic basket. And they're at a table. They're in chairs. These types of things showing that things are going to be better when they go to the North. So you also had, like we had just talked about, you had these job opportunities. So they could have a better life for themselves and for their family. They were working. And so they were out working. So they had those opportunities because of the factories that were in the North. They needed jobs. They needed employers, and the African Americans needed jobs. You also had homes. Not only did they have homes that they're able to live in, many times they would move into the same communities. So they had that community sense with African Americans, similar in culture and tradition all around them. So it gave them that sense of safety, that sense of comfort, that sense of community. Where in the sharecropping, they may be miles apart, where here they're all together in one area. This is an advertisement in Chicago. It says, if you're a stranger in this city, if you want a job, if you want a place to live, if you're having trouble with your employer, if you want information or any kind of advice, call the Chicago League of Urban Conditions Among Negroes. And what this really was, it was showing that there's a support system in these larger cities. You didn't have this in the South, especially with the KKK being so strong in the South. No one would stand up, but in the North, people were willing to stand up and say, we're here to fight for you. So they had that system of support in the North that further brought them in. So if we take a look at this, so as the African Americans began their lives as urban industrial workers in the North, they faced many challenges. Living conditions in poor neighborhoods, northern cities were horrendous. And like the poor immigrants, African Americans lived in a self-contained community, and these were commonly known as ghettos. However, some of these communities, such as Harlem, did eventually flourish. We had previously looked at a picture. Now, they may have had homes, and they had homes near each other, but these homes weren't great. They weren't great. They were clustered in small areas, and so they had these challenges that they still had to overcome. Harlem is not the only one where they really flourished, but Harlem is known to be the area where it all started for African Americans, as they were able to eventually prosper. And this is really where the Harlem Renaissance started. It came after because it really started in this small community, Harlem in New York. And this is one of the things that we're going to take a look at next. So, you've got an overview of the Great Migration, what it was, what the push and pull factors were, what types of impacts that they had, and understanding that large amounts of African Americans were moving into the North. They struggled. It was not easy for them. They had a lot of struggles that they had to overcome, but eventually they would overcome these struggles, some of these struggles, and start to prosper. And one of the ways they started prospering was through a creative nature, and that's one of the things we're going to take a look at next. If you have any questions, make sure you contact Mr. Oler. Thank you.